for the Jews that Jews are always late, right?
Yeah, Jewish.
Right, or some Jews anyway. Lubavitchers are always late. You know the joke. The joke about the Yakisha Jew, the German Jew. He comes home from synagogue one day 15 seconds late. His wife says, "I was worried sick."
Yeah.
She says, "What happened?" He said, "No, today we switched over to Mashiv HaRuach." That's right. It's classic. Classic, right on time. Lubavitchers have never seen a clock. They don't know what a clock is, and the whole concept is insulting to them.
And more people spend time conceiving of things that are beyond time.
That's also true. Ideally. Anyway, there is
this size in my backyard.
We are streaming to the internet and ready to begin at any time. Good evening, gentlemen. We are in the middle of chapter 3 of the Holy Tanya, Likutei Amarim. Last time we learned, which was before Lag BaOmer, we began to discuss the difference between intellect and emotion, right? We've been spending classes going over in general the difference between the 10 faculties and how they derive from the 10 spheres. And these are, of course, the godly souls. If you ask what form is the godly soul, what's the godly soul like? What does it mean that the peace of God above literally has a form, has a shape, is defined, right? So you say that it is defined by its core personality or core traits, which are these 10 faculties, which derive from the 10 spheres above, the 10 means by which God creates the world, the 10 divine traits, as explained in Kabbalah, with which God creates. And we began to discuss the relationship of mind to emotions, which is really what the rest of our chapter is about. The rest of chapter 3 is a more in-depth discussion of Chabad, of the 3 intellectual qualities, and how they give birth, in particular, to Yira, how they give birth to the trait of love and fear, Ava and Yira, love and fear of God. Why is this very important? Why is this the main focus? How come we start the chapter talking about all the traits of the godly soul, but then the whole end of the chapter is all about the way intellect gives birth to emotions, right? And the answer is that this is really part of the grand plan of the Alter Rebbe. It's part of the grand vision of Tanya, because the Alter Rebbe, as we know, the Alter Rebbe's system came to be known as Chabad, as the system of Chochmah, Bina, and Das, the intellectual Chassidus, which is sometimes misunderstood as being primarily about intellect, which it is not. However, the intellect plays a fundamental and inerasable, unchangeable role within the system of the Alter Rebbe in a way that it does not in other forms of Chassidus, right? The other students of the Maggid, for example, of the Maggid of Mezrich, had a different understanding of the role of intellect. To the Alter Rebbe, the reason why it's called Chassidus Chabad is that if the Chassidus does not come down through the intellect, then it's not really achieving the true purpose for which it was revealed, the true purpose for which everything is created. The Alter Rebbe's whole focus, as we keep repeating, and we will continue to repeat, the entire focus of the Tanya is what's called pnimius, is the inward transformation of reality. In other words, we are not interested in superficial connections or ways in which you can bring the world and God closer to each other superficially or externally or technically. We are interested in the total inner true transformation of each thing, that godliness can be revealed literally in the absolute lowest place. And in order for this to take place within us, which is the main place, the primary place that has to be transformed and made into a vessel for godliness, in order for that to take place, godliness has to come down into our intellect. It has to come down into our understanding. And now, actually, after the past few classes, we can actually explain this, because we've been explaining that you can look at the 10 faculties, the Eser Kochos HaNefesh, the 10 faculties of the soul, you can look at them as the means by which the soul moves from not existing to existing and then to relating to other existences, right? Chachma, we start with the Sphira of Chachma, which is the highest of the Sphiras, as described in chapter 3 of Tanya anyway, and we move from there. The soul, the intellect, is how the soul establishes what it is in relation to its own source, in relation to its own inner reality, right? In other words, the soul comes from somewhere, and Chabad is the process of the soul, or some precise aspect of the soul, coming from somewhere and attaining its full being. The emotions are the way that the soul is as a being that relates to other beings, right? And then you go down through the lower faculties, and that is all the process of relation, the way that the soul actually actively relates to other things. These in general are the three divisions in the faculties of the soul: Chacham Bina Das, Chesed Gvur Tiferes, and then Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus, right? Describing all the faculties, and in the previous classes you can go and review them for the more in-depth treatment of all the different functions. One of the things that it would be remiss if we did not note at this point, we've noted something like this before, but we'll continue to take note of it as it comes up. One of the important things to realize is that under the understanding of the Alter Rebbe, under Chassidus' approach to the soul, the traditional battle of morality, which is often described as a battle between mind and heart, is not really going to be the battle as the Alter Rebbe describes it. We generally say that the mind and the heart are pulling in opposite directions. And what's interesting is that sometimes I've heard people reverse it, where the heart is the good one. It's a different story for a different time. But generally speaking, that's a more contemporary spiritualist approach to what is a traditional division, in which the mind is meant to be the one that knows what the right thing to do is, whereas the heart doesn't care what the mind understands, and the heart wants whatever it wants, and is basically, you can't deal with it. And the two are traditionally in a fight. And of course, traditionally, godliness and goodness is synonymous with reason, right? Godliness and goodness is synonymous with the reasoning faculty of the soul and everything that it represents. And what is below reason, which is the heart, right, which is the more animalistic half of the person, so to speak, has to be controlled and tamed by the intellect. Now, while this is also what it says in Chassidus, in fact, as we'll shortly see, to some extent Chassidus explains it like this, but if you zoom in and you really look at it closely, you realize there's a lot more going on here. Because, in fact, the godly soul and the animal soul, as we're going to see, both have all the faculties. In other words, the animal soul also has a mind, and the godly soul also has a heart. Right? In other words, if the difference is between the godly soul and the animal soul, then the real fight is not between mind and emotion as normally understood. In fact, as we're going to see, the mind and emotion dichotomy is really confuses things in the eyes of Chassidus. If you think of Chassidus in those terms, you will have trouble understanding what the Tanya is really getting at, because you cannot say that mind and godliness are synonymous in Chassidus. In fact, the mind and the emotions are equally godly in the eyes of Chassidus. They are equally opportunities to manifest godliness, and the emotions of the godly soul are absolutely focused on God at all times by nature, whereas the animal soul's mind is not able to really understand godliness. So in other words, there's emotions which are higher than the intellect in the systems of Chassidus. The emotions of the godly soul are godly, whereas the mind of the animal soul is, at the very least, non-godly and often animalistic, right? So really, this has many, many ramifications in the practical directives of Chassidus, which we will try and track if we remember and if we can through our study of the Tanya. Just to give you one example, in Chassidus we say that sadness in the service of Hashem is like to Chassidim is an avera mid'oraisa. Sadness is one of the greatest transgressions. Sadness is a transgression in a way that's worse than any of the real transgressions of the Torah, right? For various reasons that we'll get into at much greater length later in Tanya, God willing. But sadness is a terrible, is one of the worst things you can have in your service of God. Now, the question is, in a way, you would think that all the emotions should be equal because they're all emotions, right? In other words, shouldn't the goal not to be to conquer sadness? The goal should be to conquer all emotionality, right? Because all the emotions are to some extent irrational or non-rational, right? All the emotions get carried away. All the emotions are not really able to capture the truth. Shouldn't it be that the mind's job is to control all the emotions? Why this emphasis on sadness, right? And the answer is because we're working from a completely different system, right? We don't see the emotions as a negative thing, right? The emotions are a thing to be educated, are a thing to be transformed. Sometimes they're quite negative, right? Just by being emotions. And we're going to say that the animal soul is primarily emotional. So, in a sense, the emotions are more distant from God, and all of that's true. However, on the other hand, the problem with sadness, you would never catch the problem with sadness if you think that it's just another emotion. The problem with sadness is much more profound. Sadness is a spiritual rejection of God. It is a form of godlessness, not a mere emotion. Right? And you are never able to make that distinction if you think that all emotions are constitute godlessness because God is an intellectual thing, because God is an idea, which is something that Chassidus rejects very forcefully. Yeah, that was just an illustration of different way of looking at things that we are slowly introducing, even as we learn about how the godly soul has both mind and emotions. And as I said, most of this chapter is about how the godly soul's mind gives birth to the emotions. So really, the importance of this to the Tanya, as we're going to see, is that the godly soul, as a being primarily of intellect, as the soul most associated with intellect, even more than the Nefesh HaSichlis, which is ironic, because the Nefesh HaSichlis, the third soul, is called the intellectual soul, but the godly soul is actually more intellectual than the intellectual soul, which we'll discuss maybe a different time. The godly soul, by being the intellectual soul, has a direct perception of godliness. That's really how it works in Chassidus. The way, as we are going to explain the whole Chassidic Aveda, and it's going to take many chapters of Tanya to build up to it, but absolutely critical to Chassidus is the idea that the godly soul, and we said really this is the whole function of a godly soul, this is why it's the second chapter of Tanya is about the godly soul, because the godly soul has a direct perception of godliness at varying different levels. Sometimes it's called emunah, sometimes it's called chachma, sometimes it's called das. It has different ways of perceiving and knowing godliness. And that knowledge, because the godly soul and the animal soul are profoundly interleaved and connected, therefore the godliness that the godly soul perceives can be brought down and given over to and transferred to the animal soul in a process of education, where the animal soul is slowly educated and trained to appreciate godliness. And therefore, this whole process that we are discussing, where the intellect gives birth to the emotions, is very important, because the truth is that the animal soul only really appreciates emotions, and the godly soul only really appreciates intellect. So in order to have Aveda Pnimis, in order to have self-transformation in the pursuit of godliness, which is really the goal of the Alter Rebbe, the Chassidus in general introduced the idea of, or Chassidus made a focus. The Holy Baal Shem Tov made a focus on being able to find the faith within the Jewish soul. The Alter Rebbe made it a focus and made it a demand and made it a possibility that faith should become the animating power of every one of the soul's faculties and of all realities. Right? In other words, this faith should be all permeating, and that's our job. That's why we're here. God puts us here because He puts us in the lowest place in order that every single thing should be permeated by and motivated by and live from that faith at its own level. And the only way that can take place, and this true self-transformation can take place, is through the birth of the emotions from the intellect in the godly soul. So that is the primary reason why we're discussing in this chapter what we're discussing. So, without further ado, that's the review. If there's any questions, let's take them. And otherwise, let's open up our Tanyas. Okay, we are up to, I believe, if we read it last time, we'll read it again. We are on the second to last line of page Zion, starting the Chabad and Chabad, which on page 10 in the English is about 5 lines up, starts Chabad. Chabad, the intellectual faculties.
What?
Yeah. Chabad, the intellectual faculties, right at the end of page 10. So we said last time, we read last time that the emotions, we said that the emotions are love of God and pachad and yira, which are two forms of fear. And I told you that later we discuss why there's 2 words for fear, etc. So we're still not up to it, but we will, God willing. And the lefare, which we said was corresponds to tiferes, the glorification of God, right? And now the Chabad. Chachma, Bina, and Das. Nikro are called imais, the mothers, umakar lemidais, and the source of the midais. Ki amidais hein teldas Chabad, because the midais, the emotions, are the offspring or the children of Chabad, of Chachma, Bina, and Das. So, let's review quickly what we said about Chachma, Bina, and Das in the past. These are the 3 intellectual faculties. These are the 3 ways in which the soul creates its own form in relation to its source, in relation to something that's above it, right? Or a different way of saying this that I said in our previous reviews is that the intellect is the way that the soul transforms itself to be the expression of something else, right? Whereas midos, the emotions, as we said, is the soul going out of itself to transform something else or to have an effect on something else, right? So the soul in the intellect is the soul's becoming something, right? Whereas the emotions are the effort of the soul or the act of the soul making other things become, very roughly, right? Very roughly. So in the intellect, you have 3 steps in Chassidus. You have Chachma, Bina, and Das. Chachma, which as we're going to learn is the masculine side on the right side of the spheres, whatever masculine means, and Bina is the feminine side, normally translated as wisdom and understanding. I don't know if what those translations are, what those words mean, I suppose. Chachma, as we said, is when there is a profound awareness of something. This awareness is an awareness in the state of bittul, is an awareness in the state of the person themselves does not really exist yet. Chabad, Chachma, when you have Chachma, when you relate to something through Chachma, you basically see the thing as it is, right? In other words, you are in a pure state of receiving, which is very interesting because Bina is normally called the receiver and Chachma the giver, but in fact, in a way, it's the opposite. Chachma is very much the receiver because Chachma is very much the state of I don't exist. This thing exists in my awareness in a way where the thing that is aware of it has not yet existed, right? It's in a naive state where there's something that's observed and the observer does not really yet enter the picture, right? Which is a profound ability of the soul. It is a profound statement to say that the self or the person is able to know something without really mixing in their own ego, their own being, their own self, right? Normally, as we're going to say later in Tanya, this is an experience of a very, very brief amount of time. That's why Chachma, as we're going to read later, is called the Barak HaMavrik, or the lightning flash, the flash of intuition, the breakthrough, eureka, is Chachma, right? Because almost instantaneously, we take the thing and then we start analyzing it. And we start trying to understand what it is. And that immediately is Bina. That immediately is the that which takes the what Chachma sees and then tries to surround it, tries to ingest it, tries to understand it. Take it apart, put it back together again, and get a grip on it, right? Bina is often called tfisa in Chassidus. Bina is called grasping, right? In the physical act of grasping, you can only grasp something if you can surround it to an extent, right? So similarly with Bina is that the thing is now surrounded. In Chachma, there was no you to surround it. Bina is the process of building yourself, in a sense, in relation to the thing, of building your intellectual landscape around this thing, right? If you were poetic, you might say, as I heard, I think Leonard Cohen once say, talking about Judaism, although not about Chachma and Bina, you would say that Chachma is like the irritation and Bina is the pearl, right?
Bina is
the pearl. Chachma is like the thing that gets in there that makes us start secreting around it, right? Whereas Bina is the pearl. Bina is what we build around it, right? And it's all us. Bina is me. I've surrounded this irritation. I've got it all enclosed from all sides, right? Which is not to say sometimes it isn't beautiful in the poetic metaphor or valuable. However, it is me. The irritation, in a sense, was much more pure, because the irritation was something that existed on its own. It came to us from the outside. It's not something that we got our grubby little paws on and started messing up, right? Das, the third step of the intellect, takes, and really its function is not what we would classically consider intellectual, even less than Chachma. In the natural order of what we in common parlance in America in 2022 would call the intellect, the most common thing we'd be speaking about is Bina. Sometimes when we talk about the mind, we might be talking about Chachma, and very rarely would we be talking about Das. Das is the least what we commonly consider the mind or intellective of the three intellectual faculties. The function of Das is, as we explained previously, is connection and awareness. Das brings us and the reality that we understand in Bina into the same reality. In other words, the thing that I have received in Chachma and now built upon and invested in and absorbed and built into my world with Bina is actually as real as I am. That's Das. Das is, this thing is as real as me. It's actually real, right? Chachma also has a function of making things real, which is actually directly relevant to the third chapter of Tanya. Chachma is often called hisamtus. The Chachma is the making the thing true. That's why Chachma is often referred to as sight, because seeing is believing, right? If you see something with chachma, it is a direct experience of the thing rather than hearsay, right? When you see it you saw it with your own eyes, that's chachma, right? Bina is hearing, is the internalization. It's serial. It's more over time rather than an instantaneous glance, right? All these different things about hearing rather than seeing, which are associated with bina. And das is making the thing real. I would say that I would propose that the difference between the thing being real to us when it's in chachma and the thing being real to us when it's in das is that das is after bina. That's really the difference, right? It's a long discussion, not for now, but it stands to reason. I think it makes sense. The way I would put it is that Chachma and Bina are really opposites, right? You can have one or the other. You have to choose, right? In general, with the things on opposite sides of the spheres, this is how it is, right? Each one has a mila, each one has a quality, right? You have to choose. If the thing is going to be absolutely real, like it is in Chachma, like when you see something, right? And the thing that you see is much more real in a way than once you start analyzing and trying to understand it. Because when you try analyzing and understanding, it's only ever as real as your mind. It's not like something coming to you from the outside as a whole conceived being that you did not create, that you didn't build, right? When Chachma is like this thing falls into your reality, right? And you know it didn't come from your own messing with it and your own messing around and your own self-deception, because this thing literally fell full formed into my head. That's Chachma. Bina, on the other hand, is I can understand it much better. It can be much more real to me in the sense of it fits into the rest of my reality, right? Because Chachma, there's no argument for why it fits. Chachma is just, here it is, deal with it. Whereas Bina is no, it fits. I can plug it into my whole landscape in my head, my whole inner world. This has its place. This has its. I understand what's above it. I understand what's below it. I understand all three of its dimensions, right? But what you lose is that pure vision of the thing itself, because now you don't have the thing itself. Now you have how the thing fits into all of my mishagas, right?
The micro and the macro.
Right? I guess, yeah, in a sense, zoom out and zoom in. Yeah, you could maybe say that. But the das is the idea that after I have bina, I can still make this thing real to me. Right? Das is chachma, is the thing is real to me with his amtos, but that reality can be ruined by bina. Right? The reality of that thing is contradictory to the relating to like bina. But das is the idea that no, on the contrary, it's by making it part of bina that on the contrary it can become the most true to me. Right? Because it's become part of my world, that means me and it can be at the same level. We could be at the same level of reality. It doesn't have to be something like chachma to be real. It can be real to me in a way of das, which is a different way of it being real.
Bina is ben, the word ben, between Chokhmah and that.
So you see this with all the progressions in the spheres, right? Chesed, Gur, and Tiferes also have a similar relationship. Chesed and Gur are opposites. Each one has its quality, but you can't have both. And then Tiferes comes and says, even after Gvura, you can still have the qualities of Chesed, right? It's not pure Chesed, it's a different thing. It's a third thing, but this third thing is a way of having the qualities. If you can find this third thing, you have the qualities of both, right? Where das is that you have the reality of Chachma and the bittul of Chachma along with the full-bodied yeshus of Bina. So the full-bodied substance and dimensionality and being of Bina. Anyway, but that's all a diversion. Pardon me.
But is it fair to say
That's
that
one big
Das
parenthetical. Yeah.
takes the Chokhmah of Bina and the Bina of Chokhmah and put them together, and this is how it becomes that?
Maybe, no idea. If that's something you've read, that sounds good. I don't know. I never thought of it that way.
See,
Yeah.
so like Chochmah Bina Das,
Yeah.
I understand that part, but then in the drawing, they actually go all the way down to Tiferes. Chochmah and Bina.
Yeah, in the different ordering of the spheres, because there's no das, there's keser instead, right? But the truth is that even in this drawing, the connections between all of the spheres are often called das as well. Das is the connector between all things, right? So even in their relation, you would probably still have something called das, right? It's similar to how when we have das in the picture, we still believe there's keser, but we just don't believe it's in the traditional place on the sphere chart. It's not one of the 10, right? So these three things, now that we understand that that's what Chachma, Bina, and Das are, we understand why they are the root of the Midas, right? Because the way that the soul constructs itself, so to speak, right? The way the self has created. It's an interesting idea, right? The soul doesn't construct itself. The soul is made by God, right? The soul is a piece of God above, literally. But the soul constructs itself in relation, and that's what the 10 spheres are, right? In other words, the soul is one thing beyond the spheres. Within the spheres, right, I have the chachma, I have this chachma and that chachma, I have this bina and that bina, relating to different things, right? And this is how the soul constructs itself as relating to particular things, right? So in other words, the soul is the soul. There's a piece of God above, literally, right? But this soul, which is the godly soul, now has to relate to something. The godly soul only relates to godliness, right? So let's give the godly soul something godly to relate to. Let's say the godly soul wants to relate to the first 3 chapters in Shar Yichud V'Emunah of Tanya, right? That's something godly, which in general is the idea that there's nothing in our universe that exists except for the word of godliness, which is constantly making it exist at any moment, right? It's like the ray of the sun and the sun. First 3 chapters of Shar Yichud V'Emunah hopefully rings a bell for some people here. We did spend a lot of time talking about it once. Anyway, so let's say that's the godly idea that the soul is connecting to, as we're going to see in the 5th chapter of Tanya. Learning Torah is one of the 2 things that this godly soul does. The other thing is doing mitzvahs, right? So, this is a process of Chachma, Bina, and Das, right? You have the divine, I hesitate to call it a concept for reasons I don't want to get into now, but we'll call it a concept. You have the divine concept, you have this divine idea, you have an idea in Torah, right? You have an inyan. The inyan that the world is totally batul, is totally nullified to the Dvar Havaya, to the Word of God, which is constantly holding it, maintaining it in existence, right? This is a godly idea, something that the godly soul is interested in, right? And the truth is that the godly soul is interested specifically in the godliness of it, not the intellectual side of it. The idea is only like the pill which carries the payload, which is the godliness of this godly concept. And ideally, when the godly soul looks at it, it doesn't see a concept. It sees a divine truth that it knows inherently, because the godly soul's understanding is based on its self-knowledge, which is called emunah, which is something else we'll discuss a different time. I just am putting this in here to point out to you that when we say the godly soul is intellectual, right, don't think what we mean is that it like goes to university. That's not the idea. Right? The godly soul is intellectual because how does godliness come down into the grasp of something? Right? It comes as what we call an idea. And the truth is that in Chachma it's not even an idea, right? Really in Bina it's an idea, and that's what's wrong with calling everything an idea, because that means you only live with Bina and not with Chachma. That's a different discussion. I'm just trying to point out to you that that's why I hesitate to use the word concept, right? It perceives godliness. Chachma is that the godly soul sees this divine reality, right? In whatever way, right? There's different levels it can see it, but the godly soul sees the truth of Elokus. It sees this godly truth that everything is totally nullified to the Dvar Havaya, to the Word of God, right? Which creates it, which is holding it in existence at every moment. That's Chachma, right? It sees it. It sees it as a reality. And if you ask what sees it, the answer is there's nothing to say about it except it's the soul that God creates. It doesn't have a form relative to this thing yet, right? So what does it do? It sees this truth, and now it wants to become part of that truth. It wants to turn itself into an extension of this divine truth, which is a different way of saying it begins to understand it, right? This is why, as we're going to learn later in Tanya, I believe chapter 6, that understanding things is dangerous. Right? That's why there's certain things that Jews are not meant to understand, right? Like you're not supposed to study idolatrous texts, for example, right? There's a reason for that, because when you understand something, you are turning yourself into an expression of that thing. Some might say that this is actually the best explanation possible for what idolatry, real idolatry, actually is, which is turning yourself into the expression of a finite spiritual form, right? So really idolatry is an act of understanding, act of bina, right? Anyway, so the nefesh elokis now understands this godly thing, which is what it must do, because you can't just have chachma for various reasons, as we're going to learn. You have to have pnimius, right? So in other words, you have to take this thing, which is theoretically perfect in chachma. You see this truth, but now it's not enough to just see the truth. You have to internalize it, because that's our whole purpose here on earth, as the Alter Rebbe would explain to you. If you don't internalize it, right, then it's never going to reach the nefesh of Bahamas, certainly, right? And it's never going to be it's not going to be totally transformational, right? It's just going to remain a separate truth. This is the famous example of what the Alter Rebbe says, which we've spoken about in this class before. This is the example of emunah and makif, right? How faith by itself is superficial, right? The famous example of the Alter Rebbe, which he brings from the Ein Yaakov, is the ganva fum machtarta rachmana karya, right? That the thief, as he's digging a tunnel into someone's house, he prays to God for success, right? And the famous question is, of course, does he believe in God or doesn't he? He prays, so he believes that God will make a difference to his success, but he also knows that God doesn't want him to succeed in being a thief, right? And yet he still prays. This paradox, this contradiction, we say, is not the sign of insanity. On the contrary, that is faith working as intended. That's what faith is by itself, right? By itself, that's faith, because faith is inherently transcendent, right? Faith is, I see the truth, but that doesn't change me in any way, right? You could use, for a different example, a much more common example, like in the Midrashim that you may have heard and things like that, that all of the miracles that the Jewish people in the desert saw, but it didn't change them, right? They saw the miracle of the splitting of the sea, and then 5 minutes later they're complaining again, right? All that sort of thing, right? It's a similar idea that seeing something divine, while incredible, and in a way much higher than when you try and internalize it, because when you internalize it, you bring it down to your level and ruin it and break it in a sense, right? But on the other hand, if the goal is your transformation and not to have beautiful things, because if it was all about having beautiful things, this reality would not be created, right? This reality is not so beautiful compared to higher realities, that it was created for its sheer beauty, right? The point is not to have beautiful things. The beautiful concept in Torah was more beautiful when the angels understood it in the world of Bria. The fact that you're understanding it down here, right, means that it's here for internalization. The point is that it's meant to go to the lowest place. So this Nefesh Elokis takes this godly thing that it sees, this godly truth from the first 3 chapters of Sha'ar Yichud Ve'emunah, and it internalizes it, right? It makes it its own. It brings it into its reality, which is through analysis, right? The way there's a beautiful sefer of beautiful and very challenging sefer of the Mittler Rebbe called Sha'ar HaYichud. Which is generally not studied in Chabad yeshivas nowadays, because it used to be studied more because we didn't have the Mamarim of the Rebbe Rashab. However, many people still study it, and it's a good thing to still study. And this Sefer of the Mittler Rebbe goes through all of Seder Hishtalshalus in order, all of the spheres, right, and all the worlds, etc. I haven't gotten very far into it myself, I have to admit to you, but one thing I do know is that in the first chapter, it discusses the difference between Chachma and Bina. Right? And there, his metaphor is very beautiful, and it's a very extended metaphor. He goes on about this metaphor for a very long time. Is that Chachma is like the wellspring. It's the Mayan, right? The wellspring, if you go all the way to the beginning of the river, you see that it comes out of the ground one drop at a time, right? It's the Mayan. It comes as a drop, right? And that single drop, that's the aperture. That's like how Chachma comes into the world through that hole, right? It comes through one drop at a time. And Chachma is a drop. That's it, right? Chachma is the whole river in a drop, right? Bina is the river, and he explains that a river is three-dimensional. He uses he uses dimensionality as his metaphor for Bina, right? The Mittel Rebbe explains that what does the river have that the drop doesn't? The river has Erech, Rechev, and Emek, right? It has length, breadth, and depth. And he explains intellectually what each of these three things are. If I recall correctly, Rechev means the application, the way an idea is situated among other ideas, is the breadth of the idea, right? Like how far does it go, wide among other ideas. Erech, the length of the river, is how far does the idea go in its effect, something like that, right? Like one idea leads to another idea, leads to another idea, the length of the river. And depth is, as hard to describe, is depth. Depth is the idea within itself. How much inside does the idea have? How many levels does it apply to? Is it a shallow idea or is it a very profound idea, right? So Bina is dimensionality. Bina has all three of these things, but it's all just an extension of that one drop that came from the wellspring, right? So similarly here, you have the godly idea that the godly soul sees. He doesn't see it as a textbook. He sees it as a truth that can be seen in one glance, right? That truth is then brought into dimensionality. It's given a structure. You have to bring it in your mind into a place where it's this idea but not this idea, or it's this idea but at a deeper level it's this, or it's this idea and that has applications which then touch on this next idea, right? All of these things, which we normally call just thinking, right? Analytical thinking, right? Bina is called Mevin Davar Mitoich Davar, understanding one thing from the inside of something else, right? From within one thing, you can find the next thing, right? It's delving into it. And then the godly soul has Das, which takes this understanding, right, and brings it the soul into its reality, makes it as real as the soul itself is. And this is a soul which is now ready to relate to this idea as a true external thing, right? Which in its dimensionality, as a fully formed and fleshed out thing. So in other words, Chacham bin and Das, going back to what I said before, the soul has now created itself in a profound sense in relation to this thing. The soul always existed, or there would be no one to see with the eyes of Chachma, right? But now, the soul exists as something that can appreciate. The way I was putting it in earlier classes is the soul has created itself in its own inner world, right? The soul now exists as a Chachma, Bina, and Das reality, right? To relate to this idea. This idea and me are now two things in a fish tank, right? We now exist as two fully formed things. There's the thing, and then there's me, who I am now in a position to relate to it, right? I'm now in a position to relate to it as a fully formed reality. We can see how this gives birth to emotions, because all the emotions of Ava and Yira are really, right, is my decision either to be open to that thing, is my reaction rather. It's not normally a decision, but it's my reaction. Interestingly, it's not a decision. We'll get back to that in a second. It's to be open to this thing that now exists to the soul I have created to relate with it, right? Or it is I'm closed off to it. I don't want to relate to it, right? It's something else. It's the other, right? It's something else. I'm not open to it. We exist in relation already because I've already Chachma Bina and Dast with this thing. However, I want to be close to that thing. I want my relationship with it to be a separate thing, a distancing relationship.
But you have to get to the understanding of it to get to the place where you can go.
Correct, because the thing doesn't really exist until I go through that process. That's the idea, right? Correct. That's all we're talking about. It doesn't exist to me. It's not real to me until we go through that process. The thing becomes real to me as a thing with which I can fully relate only through the process of seichel. And then midos determines the shape of our relationship, right? That's why midos is sometimes called personality, sometimes translated, right? Is it on my like list or my not like list? Now, interestingly, and here's where we get to really the point of this whole lecture, is that you don't choose your midos really. Midos are very, very difficult to change, almost impossible to change a midah, right? The way, I've told you this before, but the way one of my teachers in yeshiva illustrated this is he had the students write down on the right side of the page their favorite foods, and on the left side of the page their least favorite foods, right? And he said, if I paid you $10 million, could you go a month without eating anything on the right and only eating things on the left, right? Everyone said, $10 million, absolutely. Sign me up, right? I'll eat only the things on the left and not the things on the right. He said, but what if I paid you $100 million to transform your page so that everything that's on the right will belong on the left and everything that's on the left will belong on the right? And the answer is I'd love to take the money, but I don't know how I would do that, right? How do I make it so that I actually like the things that I hate and actually hate the things that I like, right? That is what it means to change a midah, right? To change a midah. Kabbalah's ol is one thing, right? That's what we mean by accepting. The first example is accepting the yoke, where I say, listen, I don't like it. It's not the thing that naturally appeals to me, but because I understand a good reason why I should do the things that I don't like, which is really what Kabbalah's ol is meant to be, by the way. It's meant to be with a good reason, like $10 million. But if I understand that then I can do it. I can do the thing that doesn't naturally appeal to me. And on the contrary, that's an incredibly freeing thing, that I'm not defined by my inherent likes and dislikes, but I can actually act however I want in relation to them. Which is why Kabbalah's ol in Chassidus is synonymous with freedom and with simcha, joy, right? Because Kabbalah's ol is the idea that my natural tendencies do not define me in this way. It's a very freeing thing. However, Kabbalah's ol is only the beginning of Avodah, as it says in the famous 41st chapter of Tanya at the beginning, which the Rebbe told everyone to memorize, right? It's only the beginning of Avodah. Reishis Avodah ve'ikara v'sharsha. The beginning of Avodah, the root of it, and its main part, right? However, real Avodah, eventually, as the Alter Rebbe said, the entire purpose of Chassidus is Lashonos Teva Midosav, is to change the nature of one's midos. The real goal, and we read that on the first page of Tanya, the real goal is that the serving of God with love and fear should be beficha b'lvavcha lasoisei, right? The real serving God should be close, which means if really the service of God is to be close, it means I have to be able to transform my midos. I really have to be able to love God and fear God, which to the Nefesh HaBahamis is not natural. It's like switching the two sides of the page to the animal soul, right? To love God more than I love a slice of pizza is very, very, very difficult. And most of the time, if we said we did such a thing, we'd be lying. We're deceiving ourselves, right? Very, very hard. However, as we're going to see when we get there, God willing, God did give us an ace in the hole in transforming the midos, right? If you don't have to transform your midos and the goal is just to be caught up in some godly experience, right? Which is not the way of the Alter Rebbe, then you wouldn't have to worry about the transformation of your emotions at all, because the goal is not to be transformed. The goal is to be constantly occupied with godliness, right? But not to actually transform yourself. The key is to be so busy and caught up in godly things that what your animal soul likes and doesn't like doesn't really matter, right? Because I'm so inspired and I have so much faith and I'm so busy involved in godly things that my animal soul really, even though it's totally unchanged, it doesn't really have time to ruin my life or get in the way, right? That's the approach the Baal Shem Tov introduced. The Alter Rebbe introduced the approach that, on the contrary, the entire purpose is to transform the midah. And even if you have to struggle your whole life to transform it 1 inch, that 1 inch will be the purpose you were created, and it's something that you'll actually own. That's actually a real achievement that you did with yourself that no one else can do, right? That's the thing that you were given as your job that no one else from the outside could fix. Only you could fix it, right? So, if the goal is but now the question becomes, okay, so my goal is to change the emotions, but how, right? It seems impossible. How do I switch the two sides of the page? You give me $100 million, I couldn't do that, right? because it's not an issue of Kabbalah soul. It's an issue of it's not an issue of accepting the yoke. It's an issue of true self-transformation, right? So what's the ace in the whole, and the whole thing, and the entirety of what Tanya is based around, the whole secret of victory, according to the Tanya, or one of the main secrets of victory, if you want to be really precise. The answer is that one thing that a person can always control is what they think about. That's the secret. The secret is that the emotions can't be controlled directly. I can't make you love God directly more than you love pizza. I can make you write on the blackboard, I will love God more than I love pizza 7,000 times. It will make no difference. But what I can do is I can transform the way you think about God, right? And if you really have the proper connection and the chain running from the chachma of the godly soul through the emotions of the animal soul, and you have this chain of aveda, this chain of transmission and of education which passes through, this is what can actually transform the animal soul, because emotions are born from intellect. If you change the way you construct yourself intellectually in relation to a reality, right, that can change the emotions that are born from it, right? You can change whether you relate to the thing with chesed or gvura. You can change whether you are open to the thing or more closed off from the thing. You want to get closer or you want to get further away, right? All of that changes based on how you construct your understanding of the thing. That is what it says here in Tanya. Nikru imais umakar limidos. The mind is called the mother, as in it gives birth to, and the source of the midos, right? This is really true of the godly soul, by the way. Remember, this chapter 3 is really about the godly soul, not about the animal soul. What's funny, because when we're going to learn about the animal soul's intellect and emotions, it's not going to say this. It only says this about the godly soul. In the godly soul, because the godly soul is not inherently emotional, the animal soul is inherently emotional, and therefore its emotions come and go almost on their own without having to be born from an idea, which is why this concept of emotions being born from ideas is actually harder to understand, even though it's talked about all the time in Chassidus, because primarily it exists in the godly soul, right? Although it does happen in the animal soul as well, just in a much lesser extent. But in the godly soul, where the emotions are not on display naturally, but rather its whole being is relation to what's beyond it, is relation to God, right? That's its nature. Therefore, whatever emotions it has are born from understanding, are born from the intellect. And so you can build love of God within yourself. You can build a love of God in the godly soul that's so powerful that it has an effect even on the animal soul, right? That it has an effect even on the nefesh habahamis, right? And really it's worked both ways, as we'll see later in Tanya, as you work on the nefesh habahamis from the bottom up, by refining the animal soul as well, and in the process, as well as trying to open the channel of communication from the godly soul to the animal soul from above, right? How do you build your love of God? How do you make it so that you love God like you used to love pizza? A very tall order, which most of us will never succeed at, as we'll see later in Tanya. But nevertheless, it's the job, right? That process is born in the intellect. The thing that we control is not how we feel. The thing that we control is what we think about at any given moment. That's the main thing that we control, right? And speech and action as well, of course. But the main thing that we control is what we think about at any time. And so we can use our thought to create the correct intellectual environment, the correct intellectual connector, to instantiate a soul that properly appreciates godliness, right? And that soul will then have a more positive relationship with godliness and a more negative relationship towards more physical and coarse things. And in a nutshell, that's the Chassidische Aveda, and it's all contained within these few words here, where it says that the intellect is the source, is the root of the emotions, which is not true in the animal soul. That's why it only says it here by the godly soul. Now, I should point out, I don't want to let this go by without mentioning it, that the ultimate, as you'll learn in many Maimarim, and so you might have this question thinking back to this class at some point in the future, as we learned in many places in Chassidus, the root of the emotions is actually deeper than the intellect. It's actually deeper in the soul than the intellect. So why do we say that the intellect gives birth to the emotions? And the answer is because the intellect is more like the proximate cause of the emotions, rather than its own root in the soul. It's the intellect is the thing that actually brings forth the emotions practically at the time. It's the one that acts right there, right? The intellect is like the assassination of the Archduke. That's what the intellect does, right? It's the proximate cause, not the broader context, which is why you can't say that Gavrilo Princip, right, killed many millions in World War I and World War II, because he just killed one. It was the context, it was the broader source that made that effect. I promise you, the only Tanya class on earth in this 24 hours that's talking about Gavrilo Princip. I can't promise of all time, but I can promise today at least. Pardon me. Let's go forth just a little bit and then we'll stop. We'll stop 2 more minutes. I just want to start after the 2 dots and get going here. The 2 dots, as you'll see, the 2 vertical dots indicate a little like section break in Tanya in the last line of this page. It's the same 2 dots you'll sometimes see in the Gemara, and in fact the Tanya is printed in the same font as the Vilna Shas because they came from the same printing presses at the same time. That's also a different story for a different time. If you open up a Gemara, you'll see the Gemara, the text, the font of the Gemara, the typeface of the Gemara is the same as the Tanya. And the explanation is Ki hine haseichel shebenefesh hamaskela shu amaskel kol davar nikra b'shem chachma. The intellect in the mind of the rational soul, which is what conceives of everything, of each thing, is called chachma. Right? Chachma is the intellect that conceives of each thing, as we've already been discussing what chachma, bina, and das is. Chachma is sight. Chachma is the breakthrough. Chachma is seeing is believing. Right? His amtus. Chachma is enlightenment, right? I was in the moment of enlightenment, the eureka, right? The breakthrough. Chachma is called here Kayach Ma. The first time Tanya says this, I believe, Kayach Ma, which means the potential for what? It's literally the translation of Kayach Ma. The source of this, I believe, is in the Zohar. The Zohar says that Chachma should be read. The letters of Chachma also spell Kayach Ma, which means the potential of what, right? Which should be understood, at least at the simple level, like the Ben Tam, like the simple child at the Seder, right? What does the simple child at the Seder ask? The simple child asks, Mazes. That's his whole question. His question is, what is this? Right? And of course, we understand, especially in Chassidus, that simplicity is not a bad thing. Simplicity is and sincerity, the Ben Tam, is a good thing. Right? The Ben Tam, the Ben Chacham by the Seder, asks a whole complicated question. What's this? What's this Eidos, Chukim, and Mishpatim that you're doing? The whole thing, and we have to answer him about Tafikaiman. A whole thing, right? The Ben Tam, the simple son, asks, what is this? Which, in a way, is the most profound question you can ask about anything. Right? That is seeking the chachma, right? He is seeking to see the truth of the thing. The question, what is this, is the constant question of chachma, right? To which you might say, bina is the answer. Sometimes chachma is described as ayin and bina as yesh, right? Chachma is the question, and bina in a way is the answer, right? Chachma is mazos. What is this thing? And even when Chachma possesses something, it doesn't possess it, right? Chachma is always seeing the thing from the outside in its completeness, right? It says elsewhere that an example of Chachma is like if you're learning Gemara with someone, right? And you're dealing with a difficult sugya, and you're both quiet, and you're trying to understand what you've just read, right? And your chavrusa says, I think I understand it. And you say, well, tell me, what do you understand? He says, no, quiet. I don't have it yet, right? So Chachma is when you have it but you don't have it, right? Chachma is, and in fact, in some ways, once you try and understand it and convey that Chachma, you become much less certain about it always, right? In Chachma, you saw that it was true in that moment, even though you couldn't put into words what you had yet, right? At that moment, you saw the truth of the thing, right? Once you bring it down and put it into Bina and try and explain to someone, it just sounds stupid. You ruin the whole thing, even just trying to explain it, right? So when you had it but you don't have it, you have it. You had it but you couldn't put it into words, right? Chachma. The thing, I saw the thing. So it's kayach ma, right? And it's kayach also means potential, right? Chachma is the potential, bina is the actual, right? Chachma is the thing as it could be, right? As it could come into full existence to me. Bina is as it comes into full existence. And of course, as in many things, in some ways the potential is higher than the actual, because in a way, no actual really fully captures everything that was in the vision of the potential, right? Maybe you could say. But anyway, so that's Kayachma. This is why at the end of the day, when we think Chachma, we'll stop with this, when we think Chachma, which is normally translated as wisdom, in Chassidus you should always be thinking Bittul. Chachma is Bittul. Chachma is nullification, right? Chachma means I am able to do something, but without myself being involved, which is why it is incredibly important and the highest possible thing that the soul can do, right? The highest thing that the soul can do is Chachma, because Chachma is that the soul can act, but without my own yesh, my own yeshus, my own ego, and my own sense of self being involved at all, right? So I can have something else, right? I can have the truth that I see, but without ruining it, before I ruin it yet, before I bring it into my yeshus, right? Which means Chachma is a very high and profound thing, and why in Tanya, Chachma is used as the name for everything that's above Chachma as well. Because the vessel for everything in the soul that's above Chachma, it all comes down to Chachma. It all comes down in the soul's ability to directly see something without having to involve the intermediary of its ego and of itself, etc. Right? So Chachma is bittul, Chachma is nullification. Chachma, you could even think of, although sometimes this will get confusing because sometimes we make distinctions between these two things, but in many places you can even think of Chachma more as faith than as intellect. Right? Chachma is the soul's direct connection to something. It's direct, supra-intellectual connection, whereas Bina is really the rational, right? It's a different way of thinking about it. Okay, next week, God willing, we'll continue with Bina and on to the Midas, the emotions, God willing.